The opposite of a fact is a falsehood. But the opposite of a profound truth may be another profound truth. Newtonian physics in his world is a profound truth. But Newtonian laws are not complete because they are subject to relativity. Now, pride can block our ability to recognize a new truth. If we believe that one idea is so universal that it explains everything on a given subject, we can be too invested in that idea to consider new perspectives. For example, consider the causes of the Civil War. Today's dominant interpretation was that it was caused by slavery because the Declaration of Secession, a declaration of causes for secession, written by most of the first 7 states to secede, cited the protection of slavery as a reason for leaving the Union. But the opposite of that theory is the truth that secession need not have led to war. Everyone knew that the Cotton States had no intent to invade the Union and replace the Washington, D.C. government. War came only when Northerners decided to put military coercion onto the Cotton States to bring them back into the Union. But they did not call it coercion. Instead, they referred to it as preserving the Union. Most modern historians will cite preserving the Union as the Northern war motivation, without ever mentioning that the same concept from the Southerners' perspective is coercion. Now, the accuracy of the descriptor is entirely dependent upon whether one's perspective is Northern or Southern. Neither descriptor is a universal truth. Today's prevailing synopsis is that Southerners caused the Civil War by illegally seceding from the United States to perpetuate black slavery. The original 7-state Confederacy, which included Texas, started fighting when it bombarded Fort Sumter. Northerners virtuously responded by suppressing the Confederacy's rebellion, thereby ending slavery and establishing political equality for the ex-slaves. That's the received wisdom. Let's get into it. Almost all of that summary is erroneous or deceptive. Let's go to the third slide. Fort Sumter. There we go. First, Northerners could have evacuated Fort Sumter and let the 7 Cotton States depart in peace. The South was not allowed to leave peacefully, chiefly because Northerners wanted to avoid the economic consequences of disunion, including the effects of a low tariff Confederacy being adjacent to the federal union. The overpriced goods of tariff-protected manufactured goods from New England and other parts in the North would have lost their southern markets to more efficient European producers. Tax revenues, predominantly reliant upon customs duties, would have declined by the proportions that Southerners paid for whatever goods they imported. Northerners would have lost their legal monopoly on Southern coastal shipping, and the USA would have lost 60% of its exports, thereby becoming a perpetual debtor nation. Let's go to slide 4. About a month before Sumter, a Boston newspaper concluded that the 7 Cotton States did not secede to protect slavery, but to form a new country that would be an economic rival to the North. Specifically, the Boston Transcript editorialized on March 18th, 1861, alleged grievance, and this is I'm quoting, alleged grievances in regard to slavery were originally the causes of this for the separation of the cotton states, but the mask has been thrown off, and it is apparent that the people of the seceding states are now for commercial independence. The merchants of New Orleans, Charleston, and Savannah are possessed with the idea that New York, Boston, and Philadelphia may be shorn of their mercantile greatness by a revenue system verging upon free trade. If the Southern Confederation is allowed to carry out a policy by which only nominal duties is laid upon imports, no doubt the businesses of the chief northern cities will be seriously injured. The transcript's analysis underscores the importance of evaluating northern motivations for coercion instead of merely southern motivations for secession. Let's take a look at slide 5. Okay, there you can see here at the end of the Civil War, imports on the last year of the war were 240 million. But the very next year, they almost doubled to 435 million. That is imports, not exports. But the reason the imports went up so much is because the South was able to export. And by being permitted to export, um, the people that were importing goods to us had the money to buy our exports. That's a key concept. John C. Calhoun put it originally. The South, we export to import. And the overall trade business was largely determined by whatever the South did. Even if the South did not import, by exporting cotton, they created a market for imported goods because that by exporting cotton, they gave the people that were delivering the cotton the money they needed to buy imports from the United States. It's kind of a little bit of a tricky concept to appreciate, but if you think of trade being dependent upon two things, imports and exports. If exports go up, then there's money available to buy imports. And if exports don't go up, there's no money available to buy imports, except what was the baseline. But this is a big change in the analysis. If you realize that it was the exports of the southern states that created the money to enable overseas merchants from Great Britain and elsewhere to buy our exported goods. Okay. Moreover, this slide shows, and I'll just read what I have to say here. This, slide 5 shows that the South's return to international trade in 1866 led to an 82% increase in American imports, although the region contained only 26% of the country's population. The key to the rise in the imports was the simultaneous rise in exports. Exports provided the money Americans needed to buy imports, and that's what caused imports to go up. Since the cotton remained the leading export, the South remained the key to America's international trade. As John C. Calhoun put it, we export to import. That's where the money comes from. Cotton provides the money for international trade, including imports. Let's take a look at slide 6. A second deception regarding the summary of what we're taught today are the causes of the Civil War. The second deception is that the use of hindsight to determine secession's illegality. In 1860, there was no consensus on the legal status of secession. In fact, the northeastern states threatened secession at least 5 times between the founding of the Republic in 1789 and 1850. First, during George Washington's presidency, when Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton warned that the northeastern states would secede unless the federal government agreed to assume their obligations to pay off their Revolutionary War debts. Well, that's what they did. The federal government assumed that obligation, and the northern states didn't have to worry about it because the federal government paid it. Next, in 1803, New Englanders threatened to secede over the Louisiana Purchase. They didn't want to share new territories that would ultimately become new states, thereby reducing New England's influence in the federal union. Connecticut Senator James Hillhouse warned, quote, "The eastern states must and will dissolve the union and form a separate government if they did not get their way on this issue." In 1807, New England again threatened to secede after Jefferson Davis tried to avoid the War of 1812 with a trade embargo. Rather than have a war, he hoped by embargoing trade, he could stop it. New Englanders objected because their region was then America's maritime center, and New England traded extensively with Great Britain during the War of 1812. After that war started, most New Englanders cooperated little in the nation's defense. Massachusetts, for example, refused to turn over their militia to the national service. They traded liberally with the enemy and refused to put their militia, as I say, into the federal service. When the British finally blockaded New England during the last 7 months of that 30-month war, the region held a convention in Hartford to discuss secession. In January 1815, it sent emissaries to President Madison to demand 5 additional amendments. But upon arriving in Washington, they learned that the war had already ended and went home in embarrassment. Martha, let's take a look at the next slide is 7. Now, Northeastern leaders at that time again threatened secession over the proposed annexation of Texas. The picture here is of the building where the Hartford Convention was held, where the New Englanders discussed secession and other remedies to their grievances. In 1843, 12 congressmen, including former President John Quincy Adams, signed a public letter claiming that Texas annexation would not only cause the free states to secede, but would fully, quote, would fully justify it, close quote. The Massachusetts legislature underscored his opinion by declaring in 1845 that the Texas annexation was unconstitutional. Let's take a look at slide 8. In truth, secession was a remedy geographically isolated political minorities repeatedly considered from 1789 to 1861. It tended to find favor within those regions that were out of power in Washington. It was popular in New England when Virginians were the president. Conversely, it tempted the South when Northerners controlled Washington, or merely the House of Representatives, where the South never had a majority. Important to note that the House of Representatives has the exclusive authority to originate tax bills, most notably tariffs. And that was in the control of the northern states from at least 1800 all the way into the Civil War and beyond. Let's take a look at slide number 8. Number 9. The third deception is the 4 states that joined the Confederacy after President Lincoln raised troops to coerce the first 7 cotton states back into the Union, and has falsely reported those 4 states seceded to protect slavery. But that was not the truth. In truth, all 4 seceded because they had earlier warned to Washington that they considered the forced reunification of any state to be unconstitutional, and they would fight to prevent it. After joining the Cotton States, they provided half of the white population of nearly all of her soldiers. Let's take a look at slide 10. Even though it was a smaller number of states, just to clarify, the 4 Upper South states had a bigger population. You had 7 other states in the Deep South, the Gulf South, plus Texas, well, plus South Carolina. There were 7 of those, but the 4 states that came in after the firing on Fort Sumter had an equal white had doubled the white population of those 7. A fourth deception is that the Confederacy wanted to replace, rebelled against the Washington government. But in truth, everyone knew the Confederates had no desire to replace the Washington government. They just wanted to be independent from it. Everyone knew Southerners would make no attempt to overthrow Lincoln or militarily invade the northern states if the Cotton States had been allowed to depart peacefully. The fifth pretext is that we're taught now as a cause for secession. The fifth pretext is the assumption that Southern secession was an unacceptable alternative to war because slavery otherwise would have never ended. Now, author James Oakes correctly observes in his book, The Scorpion Sting, that slavery would have eventually ended if it could not spread geographically. Southerners were fully appreciative of this point. They realized it. It was no great revelation for some later historian, Oakes, to point out that the Republicans expected that the inability to spread slavery into the territories would ultimately lead to the abolition of slavery throughout the country. Let's take a look at slide 11. In truth, a principle involving local option voting, termed popular sovereignty, demonstrated almost 2 years before the Civil War that it would block slavery expansion. That happened when Kansas voted down a slave constitution by a margin of 11,000 to 2,000. Territory of Kansas voted in 1858. Did it want to become a state? And the Constitution that had been written up said it would be a slave state, but they voted it down 11,000 to 2,000. So after 1858, if Southerners could not make a slave state out of Kansas with popular sovereignty, they could not do so with any of the federal territories remaining in 1860. Those west of Texas were too arid, and those north of Kansas too cold for slave-based agriculture. Nevertheless, it is often overlooked that the 1860 presidential candidate, John C. Breckinridge, who is so-called the Southern candidate, included popular sovereignty in his platform. To be sure, his version of popular sovereignty pertained to votes that occurred when the pertinent territories applied for statehood. But nonetheless, prior to that, Southerners claimed the right to take their slaves into those territories and any other federal territories because the territories were legally common to the entire country. But his concept of popular sovereignty is that if they voted, when they come in, they vote to come in as a state, they prepare a constitution, and they can decide through popular vote whether or not that's going to be a slave constitution or a non-slave constitution. But the obvious result is without freedom to immigrate, all future states that would be admitted to the Union would be free states by default. In other words, if blacks were not permitted to go into the Western territories, all new territories that would come in as states would later be free states. If the 1860 Republicans had also adopted popular sovereignty, they could have kept slavery quarantined in the South. I would say isolated, but apparently they look at it more like a need to quarantine slavery in the South, because they instead rejected it because it would be inconsistent with their 1856 platform. They'd failed to recognize the opportunity to endorse popular sovereignty and win their results without having to fight a war, because they knew that if they adopted that policy, there would be no need for a Republican Party. Such a policy shift, they felt, would be political suicide. Thus, Republicans were prepared to endanger the Union by deferring to the party's self-preservation instinct, which was ultimately changed to a meaningless point of honor. That is why President Lincoln rejected any compromise. One compromise proposal would have allowed slavery in the present-day states of New Mexico and Arizona, where it could not thrive. After the Senate rejected the bill, the Kansas-Nebraska bill, with all Republicans voting nay, the sponsor of that compromise, John C. Crittenden of Kentucky, asked that it be submitted to the country as a national referendum, realizing that voters would likely approve it. Approve it. The Republican-controlled Senate took action. According to historian Kenneth Stamp, quote, Republicans looked upon compromise as the shortest route to political suicide. It would have necessarily required a repudiation of their slavery ban platform. Again, continuing to quote him, to the Republicans then belonged the responsibility for no compromise was ever offered to the South. Take a look at slide 12. A sixth dubious assumption about the causes of the Civil War was the synopsis that the Southern secession was a bad alternative to preserving the Union militarily. Rejecting secession resulted in America's bloodiest war. Notwithstanding the country's population in 1860, notwithstanding the fact that the country's population in 1860 was only 1/4 that of 1940, about 700,000 soldiers died in the Civil War as compared to 400,000 in World War II. Since America's white 1860 population, from which she obtained her soldiers, was only 27 million, a 700,000 deaths among Civil War soldiers would translate to a loss of 2.6%, which means this: if we fought a war with comparable losses today, the casualties, the deaths, not just the casualties, but the battlefield deaths would have been 8.5 million if we did it today. Furthermore, as a wartime president, Lincoln ran roughshod over civil liberties. He arrested Maryland's legislators to prevent the state secession. He disbanded Missouri's legislature under the glitter of federal bayonets. He suspended habeas corpus in key parts of Maryland in defiance of a contrary ruling by the Chief Justice. He shut down opposition newspapers. He imprisoned thousands of citizens without ever charging them with the crime, just to keep them away from the voting polls. He manipulated the 1864 soldier vote. The Civil War may not have been worth the cost of violence done to done to the Constitution, and its irrevocable push toward a progressively more centralized government. Seventh, historians who cite the 7 Cotton State secession declarations of causes as proof for the primacy of slavery in the causes for the war overlook other disputes between Northerners and Southerners that were revealed by comparing their respective constitutions. Unlike the federal Constitution, the Confederacy's Constitution outlawed protective tariffs. Southerners also outlawed public work spending. If you want a railroad, either you build it yourself as a private company or have your state do it, but don't go to the Confederate government asking for money. And the Southern Confederate Constitution also prohibited subsidies for private industry. Slide 13 now, please. The Confederate Constitution only permitted spending for military defense, repayment of the national debt, and the operating costs of the central government. It also included several features that underscored a states' rights philosophy. Constitutional amendments, for example, could only be initiated by a convention of states. They couldn't be initiated in Congress. Additionally, historians who cite the Declaration of Causes to assert the primacy of slavery as a cause for the Civil War generally fail to note that at least 10 free Northern states concurrently passed legislative resolutions explaining their objections to slavery. Not one of those 10 stated any wish to abolish Southern slavery. The most consistent complaint, after fulminating with words like traitor and that sort of thing, the most consistent complaint was that a breakup of the Union would lead to economic decline. Thus, Northerners mainly went to war to avoid the economic consequences of disunion. Eighth, although antebellum Northerners increasingly imposed the expansion of slavery, before the Civil War, it was chiefly to reserve the Western lands for whites, not a noble gesture to end slavery. Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot made the first attempt to block the expansion of slavery while leaving it untouched in the slave stage. 12 weeks after the Mexican War started, he attached a rider to a $2 million military funding bill. His rider would require that slavery be prohibited in any of the territories acquired during the Mexican War. Although the soon named Wilmot Proviso is commonly misinterpreted as a moral attack on slavery, it was genuinely motivated by white supremacy. Insert slide 14, slide 14. This is what Wilmot had to say. He later became a Republican in the mid-1850s. I make no war upon the South, nor upon slavery in the South. I have no squeamish sensitivity upon the subject of slavery, nor morbid sympathy for the slave. I plead the cause of the rights of free white men. I would preserve for free white labor a fair country, a rich inheritance, where the sons of toil of my own race and of my own color can live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor. Although the 1846 proviso passed the House, it failed in the Senate. Nonetheless, it gave birth to popular sovereignty as a concept that might end the endless arguments over the future of slavery. In 1854, Democrat Senator Stephen A. Douglas sponsored the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which would have carved the Nebraska Territory out of the Kansas Territory and authorized each to decide for themselves whether they would be free state or slave states by popular vote at such time as they would apply for statehood. The same year, future President Abraham Lincoln had this to say, quote, "The whole nation," and he was saying this about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, "the whole nation is interested that the best use shall be made of these Western territories. We want them for the homes of free white people." Close quote. And by that he meant the homesteaders and blacks did not qualify for homesteads, whether they were free or slave. The party's true objective was to isolate blacks in the South. Consider that Texas statehood, after Texas statehood in 1845 to the present day, 20 of the 22 states that joined the Union after Texas had only about 1% of their populations as blacks. The two exceptions were West Virginia and Oklahoma. The northern so-called free states refused to accept black refugees during the Civil War, thereby forcing blacks to remain in so-called Southern contraband camps. As late as 1910, 50 years after the Civil War began, 90% of blacks still lived in the South. Ninth, contrary to popular belief, post-bellum Republicans were not indulgent toward their defeated foe, the Confederates. The victors' peace was primarily shaped by their antebellum economic priorities, which impoverished the South. One example was the deterrence tariff, a powerful tool enabling Northern manufacturers to establish domestic monopolies by blocking imports. It also encouraged European manufacturing economies to buy raw materials from countries other than America because America limited their ability to sell their imports into the USA. So they go ahead and send them to other countries where they could get money to buy exported goods from those other countries. And this is a key point that is missed. It was not the South that went to war over tariffs. It was the North. Let's take a look at slide 15. On the eve of the Civil War tariffs on duty-bill items averaged 19%. But they quickly increased to an average of 45% for the next 50 years. Consider railroad iron. In 1861, the 11-state Confederacy had more railroad mileage than any country in the world except the United States. Even though Southern roads badly needed rebuilding after the war, deterrence tariffs, protective tariffs, caused railroad iron to sell for $80 a ton in New York and Pennsylvania, compared to $32 a ton in Liverpool. Even though Midwestern grain states might otherwise have supported free trade, Republicans held power by indirectly bribing former Midwestern Union soldiers by giving them generous Union veterans pensions that were increased generously year after year and to include extended family members. The pensions, argued the GOP, required high tariffs to fund them. You may be surprised to learn, but the last Union veterans pension was paid to a daughter of a Confederate soldier. I think it was a Confederate soldier. No, it was either a Confederate or Union soldier. And that was in 2020. And I make a mistake there. It was a Union soldier's dependent child from a young wife. And she had some mental difficulties. But if you look, the child's teaching, the children are taught, let's say third, fourth, fifth grade type children. You're taught, well, if you look at the Civil War, before the Civil War, we had slavery. After the Civil War, we had no slavery. Ergo, the cause of the Civil War was slavery. Well, those simple-minded explanations overlook another simple-minded explanation. Or let's say, if that's a profound truth, let's show them another profound truth. The tariffs on dutiable items before the Civil War were 19%. But for the next 50 years, they were 45%. And they only went down because a Southerner got into the White House. They went right back up when the Republicans took over in the Roaring '20s, and eventually led to the economic depression of the 1930s. The Republican Party generally controlled national politics from the start of the Civil War in 1861 to the bottom of the Great Depression in 1932. Over 70 years. Each of the 12 states that joined the Union during the 35 years from 1861 to 1896 added 2 new Republican senators. It was not until 1907 when Oklahoma joined that a Democrat senator from a new state was admitted. Slide 16 now. What happened in the South was that it was essentially transformed into an internal colony of the North. It was impoverished and it remained that way for over 100 years. Republicans transformed the South into an exploited internal colony, much like Great Britain had done with Ireland. Perhaps because of slavery, the region was the world's low-cost producer of cotton before the war. But the irony is that it remained the world's low-cost producer of cotton well into the 20th century after the war, because nearly all of her people had been impoverished, not just the slaves. Black and white was dumped into poverty. Most American cotton was exported well into the 20th century. In 1860, the South's per capita income was in the 72nd percentile of the national average. After the Civil War, it dropped to the 51st percentile and stayed there until at least 1900. So if the South was at the 51st percentile, the rest of the country had to be more than double the 51% of the South. That's a radical difference in per capita income. And it did not return to its still below average 71st percentile until 1950, 90 years after the start of the Civil War. Slide 17, please. What this shows is sharecroppers. And what it shows is that the economic difference between sharecropping families was little if you looked at just race, black and white. Both of them were impoverished. Now, it's true that the whites, particularly in, I would say, prior to 1970 or so, they had a lower social standing. But if you look at these two families, you don't see much economic difference. They are impoverished, and they were put there not by white Southerners. They were put there by policies that impoverished the entire South. So the Republicans, shortly after the war, the Republicans set up puppet regimes in the South that disenfranchised ex-Confederates and transformed freedmen into a Republican loyal voting bloc. They made false promises to the freedmen and taught them to hate their former masters. When Republican Ulysses Grant was elected president in 1868, he won only a minority of America's white votes and gained the popular vote edge only because of the enslaved vote, of the ex-slave vote. Postbellum Republicans launched the Gilded Age of crony capitalism by giving away 200 million acres of land to northern railroads which was about twice of the property presently within the borders of the entire state of California. Only negligible land grants were ever given to former slaves. By 1877, Republicans had abandoned blacks because the party could control Congress and the presidency without them. The more perfect union that Lincoln had hoped to form became one in which black and white Southerners were both dumped into peonage. Even as late as 1940, as the 1940s, both races worked under conditions little different than the Russian serfs of the 19th century. The conqueror's version of black civil rights did not include having blacks live among Northerners. Since freedmen comprised a decisive Republican loyal voting bloc until 1880, the GOP wanted to keep them there. Simultaneously, Northern workers did not want black job seekers coming across the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line. Republican Congressman George Boutwell even proposed to reserve the entire state of South Carolina exclusively for blacks. Let's go to the next slide. Contrary to the misrepresentations of social justice activist historians, 19th century Jim Crow, the 19th century Jim Crow era, Northerners were at least as racist as Southerners. When French tourist Alexis de Tocqueville visited America in 1830, he observed that race prejudice was most obvious in the states that had never had slavery. At the end of the Civil War, Congressman Garrett Davis, I believe it was, of Kentucky, proposed that the black refugees from the South be proportionately spread across the country in proportion to the white vote, rather than have it all concentrated in one area. That was a non-starter for the New Englanders. They really didn't want to have that. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln said, "I am not, or ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. And as much as any other man, I am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." That is a quote. During the Jim Crow era, in 1915, when a white boxer beat aging heavyweight champion, a crowd of Wall Street bankers watching the telegraph results pounded their unknown neighbors on the back and acted like gleeful schoolchildren. Now, one of the prime reasons I wrote Causes of the Civil War was to consider the one-sided arguments that have induced mob hysteria against Confederate heritage. As noted, historian James Oak is probably correct when concluding that slavery would have ended if isolated in the South after 1860. But that could have been accomplished with popular sovereignty. There was no requirement to ban completely slaves in the territories, as the Republican Party demanded out of a self-preservation instinct. And the result was civil war. I want to thank you for your patience. I'll be happy to take questions. And as you can see, I've been reading this narration because I'm able to send you an email copy of this if you'd like. I can send it to Martha and she can send it on, but I wanted you to have this as something after we talk. Okay, I'm ready for questions if there are any. Oh yeah, let me explain. I do have a couple of books I'd like to bring to your attention. Let's go back to this is the book, Causes of the Civil War, upon which this speech is based. You can get it at Amazon. And The other one I want to show you is the next slide. This is a novel. I have started shifting to fiction. I'm writing fictional stories about this is Civil War, and they're all based upon historical facts. And when I researched the facts, there was a riddle of something that just didn't quite connect between all the information I gathered. And so I made a story out of it. The first one is the firepower, and what it tells is the secret history of the Civil War repeating rifles. They were obviously superior to anything the South had, but they took a long time to get deployed within the Union Army. And there was let's put it this way, there were interested parties that wanted everything to slow down from the point of view of getting the Union Army the protection that they would have through repeating rifles. And so what I've done is I've researched the historical facts. I've introduced all the historical characters. I've described the historical characters, told stories about them. But then I bring in, by connecting the dots, what really happened to keep the repeating rifles at a minimum until the last year of the war. So, any questions?
Well, I have one.
Yes.
I tend to be, oriented toward the Confederate cause, but it seems to me that the Southern leaders weren't entirely blameless. You could have a comment on that.
No, they weren't, but the way that the history is taught in academia now is they were entirely to blame. They put no blame on the North. I mean, look at if you're going to free the slaves, fine, that's okay, but don't expect to have only one side pay the economic penalty. There was never any organized attempt among the congressional representatives from the North to offer a bill to provide what do you call it, a compensated emancipation. A little bit of that was done. I think that Washington, D.C., during the war, did offer a compensated emancipation and executed it. But in all that period, particularly the New Englanders were criticizing the South for slavery. They never offered any kind of a compensation package, but it was common sense. Nobody's going to bankrupt themselves voluntarily. It was uncompensated emancipation was a non-starter, and anybody with any political sense would know that. But they didn't care. And that's one of the reasons, what we got was this Civil War, this very costly war. And here we are.
Well, in England, in Great Britain, they compensated the slave owners, is my understanding. So
the big wave, and the British way of freeing their slaves was primarily the Caribbean. That's where most of the slaves were, and they did offer compensated emancipation, and it was pretty generous, but the conditions down there were even more brutal than they were in the South.